So in these next set of lectures, I'm going to shift away from epidemiologic study designs and talk now about the use of epidemiology, specifically for purposes of evaluating health services. And I'm also going to talk at the end about the use of epidemiology when it comes to policy making. So what do we mean by evaluation of health services? This is a systematic process to assess the achievement of the objectives of a specific program, how adequate that program is, how effective it is, efficient, and how it impacted the population that it was applied to, and how did the target population adopt or uptake that program. So, for example, a large health insurance provider may decide to implement some specific program for its beneficiaries for weight loss. When doing that, then the health insurance provider would want to assess how effective that program was once they implemented it. I think it's important to step back and refresh our memories regarding different terms that we use. So efficacy is a term that essentially describes how well an intervention works in a situation in which all conditions are otherwise controlled, and it's in the idealized setting. So efficacy is what we measure when we perform a randomized clinical trial. That's different from effectiveness, which is evaluating an intervention or a program at a larger scale in a real-world setting or the real-world scenario. It is effectiveness that we are ultimately most interested in from a public health perspective. And then there's efficiency, and this is essentially evaluating the cost-benefit ratio of a specific intervention to determine if it's possible to achieve the goals in a cheaper or better way. When evaluating efficiency, we may be also looking at other measures such as quality of life, disability measures, maybe some social-related constructs, in addition to cost. Now, there are several different disciplines within the realm of program evaluation that I thought would be helpful to define, just so that if these come up in your readings or in your work, that you have recognized them. And these are all closely aligned. So we have what's called implementation science. This is a science that essentially assesses the extent to which efficacious health interventions can effectively be integrated within real-world public health and clinical service systems. And the information that's gained from an implementation science evaluation is viewed as generally widely applicable. The next type of discipline is called impact evaluation. This is to assess the efficacy and effectiveness in terms of intended and unintended health, social, and economic outcomes. The implementation of the knowledge for this type of evaluation is also widely applicable. And then there's program evaluation. This is to assess the processes and outcomes of a specific program with the intent on furthering its improvement. So this is very specific to the particular program that's being evaluated, and therefore the findings from a program evaluation study may not be applicable to another type of program. And then finally, there's what's called comparative effectiveness research, or CER. This is to assess which treatment or treatments work better for specific populations and under what circumstances that occurs, as well as consideration of other health indicators such as economic and social ones. Generally, findings from comparative effectiveness studies are widely applicable, but there is a clinical focus. Now, when doing health service evaluations, there can be a myriad of outcome measures that are considered if we're looking for to determine if something is efficacious or efficacy has been established. Then, of course, we need to determine which appropriate measures we're looking for. And again, depending on if the goal is to evaluate efficacy or effectiveness, the measures may differ. These measures, though, of course, must be quantifiable, and they should also be replicatable and should be easily defined as well as diagnosed, particularly at a population level if the program is implemented at that level. The measure must be standardized, and they must have an applicable or relevant population for measure. So typically in health service evaluations, we're looking at measures such as mortality, morbidity, quality of life measures, and degrees of patient satisfaction, because these are measures that are standardizable, they're certainly meaningful, and they can be measured at a population level. But with any sort of study, either a program level or a individual level, we always want to ensure that the measures that we're using are appropriate for the research questions that we're asking, right? Simply asking if a program is effective or not is not enough. We have to define what we mean by effective. So this is just an example of an evaluation for a TB control program. This is the CDC's model for TB control. And this is a particular model that just illustrates the different aspects of that TB control, so that if one were to go and do an evaluation of that TB control program, they may be focusing in on various aspects of this model. For instance, part of this model focuses on the diagnostics, and then other parts of it focus on the relaying the information at a public health level, the communicating of results at a scientific level, and then there are goals to, of course, affect or reduce the overall burden of illness. So depending on the type of program review, the measure or the endpoint may vary, right? For example, if we are interested in evaluating how successful a vaccination program is or was, these are various sort of endpoints that one may be interested in measuring. So one endpoint might be, what was the overall proportion of persons who were vaccinated? Another endpoint may be, among those persons who were vaccinated, who actually demonstrated some immunologic response. We also may be looking at the proportion who were vaccinated who later developed clinical illness. That, of course, is an important question. But the point of this is to essentially highlight that depending on the research question, the endpoint can vary. It's also important, as we talk about the evaluation of health programs, to reiterate that epidemiology typically is focused in on the etiology of a disease. We've talked about that throughout this course. We're basically interested in what causes lead to what outcomes, and that is essentially looking for the etiology. In contrast, when we're talking about evaluation of health programs or use of health programs, we're now interested in the effectiveness of that program. So does health service A lend to a specific health outcome B, again at a population level? And that is effectiveness. So the focus is on the health service and the change in the health outcomes. And like epidemiology's etiologic objectives, effectiveness in health program evaluation will also naturally take into account environmental and other factors. Now, there are a myriad of ways of performing health program evaluations. The first way I'm going to discuss is the use of group level data to evaluate the effectiveness of a program, with the idea being that generally data at a group level are available, such as national level data that one could quickly gather and use to evaluate whether or not some sort of program or evaluation program worked. So for instance, if we're interested in looking at whether or not a specific program had any impact on mortality and hospitalization rates, we could easily go to the National Inpatient Sample Survey, which are grouped data to perform a evaluation. Now, there are lots of advantages of this approach. The first is that the data are collected from real-world scenarios, as is in the case with, say, the National Inpatient Sample. Those are data from representative hospitals in the United States that are supplying information to the National Survey, which is a CDC-run system. There is a fast turnaround on these data as a result of the real-time reporting. And importantly, those data sets are generally large. And they're large and they're available, and because they're already available, the research is less expensive. Now, there are disadvantages, of course, and that is first and foremost that the data for these systems is generally collected for purposes unrelated to your research question about a program evaluation. And that then lends to whether or not you have the right endpoints or variables that you're interested in evaluating. The data can vary, in terms of the quality as well as the accuracy. And most importantly, person-level characteristics beyond basic demographics data generally are unavailable for these sort of systems. And then lastly, I have a bullet about there are concerns about ethics and data sharing, and this is germane to all sorts of research. But there are ways to deal with this concern when using group-level data as well as person-level data. I just highlight that because that is something that anytime you embark into a study using patient-level data, you have to be concerned about the ethics. So here's just one example of using group-level data to evaluate a program. This was a published study from 1996 to evaluate the effects of race and income on mortality and the use of services among Medicare beneficiaries. So the issue at the time, and probably still is an issue, is that there's known wide disparities between the use of Medicare services between Blacks and whites in the United States. So this particular study linked data from the 1990 census on data providing the median income using zip codes from 1993 Medicare data. And the study calculated age-adjusted mortality rates and age and sex-adjusted rates for various diagnoses and procedures. And here are some of the data from that publication. Essentially, the data showed that race and income have substantial effects on the mortality as well as the use of services among these Medicare beneficiaries, and that sadly Medicare coverage alone is insufficient to promote effective patterns of use by all beneficiaries. This study essentially reinforced the belief that the uptake of Medicare services differed by race as well as by income, and therefore there was a need to further understand why that is occurring and then implement ways to ensure that people who meet the Medicare beneficiary requirement, which is usually age, that they're using those services. Now, there are concerns with group-level data, and the biggest is that of a bias that's similar to that we find when we use ecologic study designs, and that's that ecological fallacy issue, which is the problem of extrapolating findings at a group level to a person level. Other biases can exist as well with using group-level data for program evaluation. Of specific importance is timing and self-selection bias that do present in these data. And the example I'm giving you here is actually discussed in the chapter in our Gordis textbook about prenatal care and prematurity and low birth weight, to highlight the concerns of both self-selection bias and time-related bias associated with shortened gestation, or bias when women do not seek care until later in their pregnancy. So just those types of bias can affect the findings and lead to misleading results. Similar to ecologic studies, in the group level program evaluation studies, we often see measures of avoidable mortality or other health indicators. This is merely to emphasize that these measures are used in the program level evaluation as well as ecologic data. So there's some overlap between ecologic studies and group level program evaluation studies.